Even wine was a luxury that many of the common people could not afford. And certainly meat hardly ever came on the table. In fact, that's why diseases like gout, which is a problem of too much protein in your system, was called a rich man's disease, because the rich man could go and kill a lamb and cook it every night. Poor people only ate lamb when they went to the festivals in Jerusalem or they went to a wedding someplace. And weddings were one of the great festivals. They didn't happen nearly as often as we might think. But they were these amazing gatherings where you would get together, and guess what you'd do? A wedding would last 7 days, and what you did for 7 days to celebrate the wedding was eat. You ate food and you drank wine, not intoxicating, because they would cut the wine 4 to 1. They would mix 3 parts water and 1 part wine to dilute it, because drunkenness was the most forbidden behavior within the Israelite Hebrew community and Jewish world. But nonetheless, this was a great time of celebration. It was a very costly. In fact, the story of the prodigal son, where the older brother is so angry because they've killed the fatted calf, it was probably the calf they'd been preparing for his wedding celebration. And that's why he was so angry that they spent it on his ne'er-do-well younger brother, who'd already wasted enough of the family's fortune. But the idea of sitting down and eating meat was a luxury that was an uncommon occurrence. And it's interesting how they would do it, because they would set up what's called a triclinium. Now, a triclinium, tri means 3, clinium means to recline. A triclinium was a table that was a 3-sided table, kind of shaped like a U, kind of a Latin U. The one side was open, and it had 3 sides, and people would recline around the table. And the way you would do it is you would always lay on your left side, lean on your left elbow. You would never, so that you could eat with your right hand, because you never ate with your left hand. Your left hand was reserved for the unclean things that you had to do. You use your left hand to touch those parts of your body that we can't mention, except for the foot. You see, the foot was considered to be the most unclean part of your body. That has significance later on. But you didn't want it, but if you had to touch your foot, use your left hand. You wouldn't use your right hand. You use your right hand to eat with. And that was the exception, the rule, except for 2 exceptions that I'll mention in a moment. But basically, you would lay on your left side and with your back to the person next to you. So if you kind of look at it like a stacking of a bunch of sardines, you'd start on one head of the table and you'd go all the way down one side, and then down this side, and then around that side, and each person laying on their left hand, and behind you, the person is also laying on your left hand. So your back is facing their face. So if you want to have a conversation with the guy behind you, you just roll back and you lean on his breast and you just start talking to him. It also creates some interesting dynamics, because you can talk to the people on either side of you, and you can talk to the person directly across from you, but that's about the limits of your conversational reach. But what's so significant about that is when we get into more details about the Last Supper itself, we know exactly where at least 4 of the people were sitting at that meal. And that has significance, because where you sat at the table was part of a very firmly established pecking order. And only one person, the one who was the host, sponsoring the meal, he would decide where each person sat in that pecking order. And that communicated volumes, because these were orders of things that were established over generations, and you didn't have to say anything. You just had to look at where somebody was sitting, and you knew what their relative status was in relationship to everyone else in the room. Well, so what we know is that they would lie on their left side, and they would reach over with their hand and take the food, and they would eat it. And at a wedding feast, because it lasted 7 days, you would eat until you were tired, and then you just simply roll over, and there would be a cushion there that you could lean on, and you just lay down like you're going to sleep, and then you sleep as long as you want, and then you can wake up, and you can eat some more food, and then you go back to sleep. Now, we look at that saying, that sounds very lazy and self-indulgent. But keep in mind, these were people who worked from sunup to sundown every day of their life, except for the Sabbath. Now, Israelites were unique from other populations of the world because God ordained that they should keep the Sabbath. And He created the Sabbath as a day of rest for people who prior to that worked every day of their life. Do you know that if you go to India today, one of the things you'll find is there are no weekends? Everybody works every day. There is no day of rest within Hinduism. And so the average person, especially amongst the poor, about 85% of the population in India, they work 365 days out of the year. There are no weekends. There are no days off. And we wonder, why is it they don't live very long? And it's interesting what Jesus said to the Pharisees. He said, you know what? The Sabbath was made for man. Man wasn't made for the Sabbath. One of the biggest criticisms Jesus had of his own generation is he said, that which I created to be a blessing, you have turned into a burden. In other words, when you go to Israel with us sometime, I'm sure you'll all go eventually, in this life or the next, one or the other. But one of the things that's the most surprising cultural experience that people have is Shabbat or Sabbath. Because we're staying in a hotel, and one of the things you find, first of all, is that as soon as the sun sets on Friday, the elevators go through a strange transformation, at least one of them. They have one elevator they call the Shabbat elevator. And what is the Shabbat elevator? It's an elevator that's pre-programmed to stop and open the door on every single floor. You want to be on a low floor, let me tell you, if you're taking it, because it literally, if it's a 20-story building, which some of them are, you just simply, it goes one floor, the door opens, and if nobody gets on or gets off, then it closes, it goes up, and you have to stay there. If you're an Orthodox Jew, you have to just let the door open, because you see, they're not supposed to light a fire, Moses said, on the Sabbath. And so if you push that button, you're sending a signal of electricity, and that is kindling a fire, therefore you cannot push a button. They'll turn the lights on and the TVs in their rooms in the hotel, and many of them go to the hotel so they don't have to prepare a meal and thereby violate the Sabbath. They'll let, heathen dogs like me prepare them food, but they don't have to do it themselves. And it's really interesting because they'll leave the door open to their room so that when it gets late, the various attendees in the hotel, the bellman and so forth, will go from room to room, and they'll look in, they'll see a door open, they're saying, would you like me to turn your TV off or turn your lights off? Because they can't touch it, because if they turn it off, they're sending an electrical signal and kindling a fire and violating the Sabbath. And that's just the beginning. It just goes on, and it goes on, and it goes on. And you look at this and you go, oh my gosh, where is the rest in this? I mean, they turned the Sabbath, a day in which people could just say, I don't have to go to work today. My boss can't make me go to work. I can just lay around and sleep and eat. Now, if you're under, say, 30, the idea of just laying around and sleeping all day and eating food is not all that exciting. You'd call that boring. When you get to my age, when you get to 60, it's a dream come true. I mean, we yearn for these kind of moments. What are you going to do this weekend? Nothing. Absolutely nothing. But you see, these were people who worked hard, and most of them were dead by the time they were 40. A day of rest was a great blessing and a great grace. And so they would celebrate. I mean, a whole week would be set aside for a wedding to celebrate, and there's a whole set of symbolisms that's tied into that maybe I'll share sometime in the future. Tremendous messages of redemption just in how they did a wedding. But let's bring it down to the Passover feast, because the Passover feast was the one time in a year when everybody got to eat meat, and not a lot of meat. It wasn't like you got a leg of lamb and you sat in the corner and chewed on it like a hungry dog or something. No, actually, it was mainly just a stew, what the New Testament translates as a sop. It's a stew made with mutton, because you see, every lamb had to be served to 10 families. 10 families would join together, and they would have one lamb, and they would share that lamb together. So you realize lambs aren't that big. There's not that much meat on a lamb, and so when they get done cutting it up and everything, there's plenty there to make a good stew, but it's not like you can have this great big slab, not like Thanksgiving dinner with your slab of turkey or whatever you have on your plate. You just have cubes of meat in there. And basically, you'd have a number of other things, all with symbolism as part of the meal. But it's important to understand that the key element of the meal was the bread and the wine. In fact, there were 4 different places where the bread and wine featured prominently in the Last Supper. And so these symbols of bread and wine are carried over by Jesus into the communion service, that we find that what's really focused on is the breaking of the bread and the sharing in the cup.